Hit record. All right. So, welcome. And I'm Isabel. For those of you who might not know me, I'm the president of the National Home Funeral Alliance. And tonight I will be fielding any and all tech issues that you all might have. And I am also, if you have a question or anything that you would like read in the chat, I will also be fielding any of those questions. But this is going to be a very fluid conversation. So Mark will invite questions throughout the presentation. So feel free to jump in at any of those times verbally as well. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Mark to introduce himself. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Isabel. My name is Marc Markell, as you can see on the screen. And after my name, I have a Ph.D., and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I have a CT, which is Certified Thanatologist. And some people aren't familiar with that term, but thanatology is the study of death, dying, and grief. And so as a thanatologist, I get to do a lot of things like present tonight, and I do writing, and I do teaching, and so on. So I'm really excited about being here. And we're going to be talking tonight about grief and people with disabilities. And it's paradoxically universal and individual, as with all grief, but there are some more specific characteristics and some challenges that some people with disabilities may have. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to talk about person first versus identity first terminology. And that's something that is rapidly changing from about the last 40 years, where it has always been person first. We'll talk about cyclical grief, and specifically with people with disabilities and parents of people with disabilities. Then we're going to talk about the unique needs of people with cognitive and developmental disabilities. We're also going to be talking about people with all disabilities in that area, but we're going to focus more on people that are more concrete thinkers, because there tends to be some challenges when people are grieving and interacting with people who are grieving, who tend to be concrete in their thinking. Then we'll talk about things to remember when companioning people with disabilities through grief. Companioning is a term that Alan Wolfelt, who does a lot in the area of grief and loss, and especially with children, he uses that term quite a bit to talk about how people who are grieving are not, it's not necessarily helpful to treat them, but it is helpful to companion a person and to be with them as they are going through this grief process. And then at the end, I'm going to read a poem, and hopefully we'll have some conversation as we go through, and questions and comments and so on. I just retired from St. Cloud State University, which is in central Minnesota. I actually retired a year ago. It doesn't seem that long. So I'm emeritus. I did get to keep my email address. So I have that as my primary email that I can be in contact through. I also teach at Worsham College of Mortuary Science, and I teach a class on psychology with an emphasis on funeral service. And then I teach at Anoka Ramsey Community College, and I am going to start teaching in the Masters of Thanatology program at Edgewood College in Madison. And both the Worsham and Edgewood both are asynchronous online courses. So I unfortunately don't get to interact with my students a lot, but by email and sometimes by text and so on. So that's a little different for me, because I really enjoy face-to-face classes and face-to-face presentations as much as possible. I'm not going to go through everything. This is kind of a condensed version of my vita, but I wanted to just highlight a couple things, and I'm going to start from the bottom. I am certified in death and grief studies from the Center for Loss, which is Alan Wolfelt's organization, and it's through Colorado State. And then through Association of Death Educators and Counseling, I'm a certified thanatologist, and I'm also a celebrant, a life tribute professional. So I can, and I have done funeral services for people that would like that. And celebrants were started primarily because of the number of people who didn't have an active religion that they were participating in, or no religion at all, and they wanted to have some sort of service, but it wasn't, they didn't have a minister or a priest or a rabbi that could do that, or an imam. So celebrants started filling that void and putting together eulogies and putting together the service. And so that's a real gift to be able to do that. I'm also a professional developer, and I'm very excited because this overlaps in a lot of different areas. I'm a certified parent coach. And what I do primarily as a parent coach is work with families of kids that are very intense and work on different strategies and skills to do gentle parenting and positive discipline and that kind of thing. And it really does leak over into a lot of other areas that I am involved with. In addition to that, I've taught in a variety of different places and different general ed and special ed classes. So my primary focus has been with people with cognitive disabilities, but I did teach at the middle school with kids with emotional and behavior learning disabilities and mild cognitive disabilities, and then a high school for kids that they would always give me a bad time about that because they were 18, some of them, and with students with moderate to severe and severe profound cognitive disabilities. So they had some of them were fairly high functioning, but most of them were working on some very basic kinds of skills and communication and that kind of thing. Two of the things that I'm just really proud of is at our church, we started death education for non-grieving, presumably non-grieving children, 2nd and 3rd grade and 6th and 7th grade. So we do a 6-week unit every year, and we present death education, which is not a common thing. And the church that I belong to is a very progressive church, and I asked if that would be something they would ever be interested in, and the person I talked to said, "Yeah, when do you want to start?" So it was a fairly easy process to start doing that. And then I also did work this last year in middle school and high school, some high schools, with grief groups for kids that felt disenfranchised or suffocated grief and had experienced trauma. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not supported at the same level as other people may get the support. So people with disabilities are oftentimes disenfranchised. They don't get the same level of support that other people might. And suffocated grief is a relatively new term that talks about how some people, especially people who are BIPOC, not only experience disenfranchised grief, but they also are punished for their grief and their grief reactions. So that's me. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which a lot of people know of her, she was a real pioneer in the area of death and dying. She talked about children are the forgotten mourners. And when I read that, I thought, that's absolutely true from my perspective. And people with disabilities, I think, are oftentimes ignored mourners. I don't even think they get to the level of being forgotten. I think they're just totally ignored oftentimes. And so one thing that I feel very grateful for is being able to talk to people and to give some information about people with disabilities in a way that hopefully will help them and in the future. I do want to just introduce you quickly to 5 students. 4 of them, I have their obituary pictures, but I don't have Lori's. She died in 1997. This was my first class when I was teaching at the high school level. And as you can see by the dates, several of them have died within the last couple of years. And they were all my students. I had 13 students, and 5 of them have died so far. And they were the most joyful, wonderful group of students that I could ever have imagined. And one of the things I usually read the obituary for Debbie because it was so real. She just loved laughing. and she loved teasing people, and she loved humor. And one thing I'll just share with Lee, who died in 2021. Lee, every morning, the school started at 8 o'clock, and Lee got there by 7:30. Well, I'd usually get there about 7:30, 7:35, and every single morning I'd walk in the door and he'd yell down the hall, "You're late." And so we always kind of joked about being late. And then Todd was just a really sweet guy, and so was Patrick. They were, I always felt like I would even if I was in a bad mood, I would come in, and they, for the most part, I mean, certainly they had their days like everyone does, but for the most part, they had just a real joyful essence to their lives. I want to just mention a couple things. One is that we all have limitations and we all have strengths. And some limitations are identified as disabilities, and some limitations are not identified as disabilities. And so it certainly could be that we're interacting with people all the time, and some may have disabilities that are not diagnosed and may be hidden. And so that can be somewhat problematic if you don't know what their specific needs might be. The other is that some disabilities are hidden, and we wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at a person or talking with a person that they had a disability. I had talked to some people just the other day. I'm teaching a class right now on introduction to disabilities. And I was saying that I have 3 different disabilities, all of which are hidden. And people wouldn't necessarily know unless I tell them that I have a reading disability. I do have a Ph.D. I have a lot of strategies. I've used a lot of strategies in my life. I have depression and anxiety, and I also have diabetes. And all of those are considered to be disabilities. Some people kind of don't think of diabetes as a disability, but it certainly is. And so people wouldn't know necessarily that that's part of who I am if I didn't tell them. The last thing I want to say on this is that disabilities, it's a very diverse group of people. And in fact, there may be more diversity within any population of any disability area than between the disability area and non-disabled people. And sometimes people certainly want to pigeonhole people into, this is what they're like, this is how they behave, this is what they need. And the reality is that they're all different. There is a saying with people with autism or autistic people, and that's, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, because autism is so incredibly varied, as all disabilities are. So cognitive disabilities, mental illness, physical disabilities, blind, low vision, and so on, is that you can have some general feelings about, what that group needs or is like, some characteristics, but overall, people are people, and people are very diverse and have very different needs and wants. As I was talking a little bit about this with disabilities, the term disability and handicapped are oftentimes interchanged. And they really are not. A disability is a functional limitation that interferes with the person's ability to walk, hear, think, learn, whatever it might be. Whereas the term handicap describes a situation or a barrier imposed by society or the environment or by oneself. So as you can see over on the side of the screen, there's a ramp. Well, if somebody used a wheelchair for mobility, or maybe a walker or crutches, that would be helpful to them to be able to use the ramp rather than stairs. And in that case, they would still have a disability, but they wouldn't be handicapped by the environment. And so one of the things that I have taught more and more over the years, when I'm talking to teachers and parents and so on, is the concept of universal design. And universal design is thinking about how could whatever we're doing, whether it's architecture, whether it's instruction, whether it's a game, whatever it is, how might this meet the needs of most people? So how can we structure this so that it can meet most people's needs, so we don't have to individually change the structure of the building or the game or the instruction? It's as universal as we can get it. So as a real quick example, I'll tell you, when I teach at the university level, I'm doing a lot of adjunct teaching now, and I don't give tests much anymore. I every once in a while I'll give a quiz if it's just on a reading or whatever. But what my students do is they decide how they're going to show mastery of the material. And we do have some guidelines, but they can do virtually anything they want to show mastery. When I first started doing this, I started reading some of the options that was in a book that I was reading on universal design. And some of them are, a piece of art, a poem, whatever it might be. And I thought, no, that's not going to do it. And it does. It can be very effective. I have had some of the most wonderful poems that show mastery of the material. And so it just can be done in a whole variety of ways. So that automatically meets the needs of everyone, because they get to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to present the information and show mastery. All right. Oh, and then I put at the top, nothing about us without us. I think that that's a really important thing for all of us to remember, is that when we're making decisions for people with disabilities or for any group of people, that we need to include that group of people in the decision making, so that we're not from the outside making decisions. There is nothing wrong with a person with disability. What's wrong is the way people treat them. People with disabilities are part of diversity. And sometimes they're going to need some additional support because of their disability, but they're part of disability, they're part of diversity. And so the thing that I know, when I've talked to people and they kind of say, oh, those poor people, that whatever, it's like, no, everybody's got limitations, everybody's got strengths, and they are people that are part of this whole wonderful array of diversity in our world. Don't give excessive praise or attention to a person with disability or to patronize them. I'm going to talk in just a minute. I think in just a second. Oh, no, I'm going to go back. Sorry. I'll talk in just a minute about, how people are people and an adult with a disability is an adult. And please treat people with disabilities and people in general with respect and dignity, and don't assume a lot of things. There is a student that I had several years ago, and now we're friends, and she uses a wheelchair for mobility most of the time. She can walk short distances. And one day in class, she parked her wheelchair to the side of the room, and she walked to her desk. And as she was walking, she fell. And I said, do you need help getting up? And she said, no, I'm fine. And I said, okay. And so I just went back to what I was doing. And she sat down and she said, I just want to thank you. And I said, okay. And she said, you didn't run and start pulling me up. She said, I can't tell you how many people do that, even when I say no. And she said, with my wheelchair, she said, people oftentimes will just hang on my wheelchair, or they start moving my wheelchair. And it's like, don't do that. This is part of who I am. And you need to ask prior to doing anything like that. So just to keep that in mind. One thing I do also want to mention, primarily because I told this person's mom at his funeral that I would do what I could to get information out about mental illness. This is what was on Facebook, and I blocked out some of the information, but this person, well, I'll just read it. This is one of the last pictures I have of my son, and the very last one I have of him smiling the smile that I knew for 27 years. Watching him play on the beach with his sister back in August reminded me of who he was underneath all of his internal battles. Now, she used the word committed suicide. Oftentimes people will say died by suicide, completed suicide, but she said committed. Her son committed suicide in 2022, and she said, my grief is indescribable. The loss is unimaginable, and here I am, and yet here I am living into it. And then she goes on to talk about the funeral service or the memorial. And then she says, mental illness does not have to be fatal. If you or someone you know is thinking about suicide and seeking emotional support, please call this number. When I found out about his death, his mom called and she told me about his death and said, I am incredibly sad and I'm not surprised. She said he tried this several times without success, and he's attempted it multiple times. And I knew that at some point this might happen because he would not get the support he needed for his mental illness. So I just wanted to share that because I think it's really important that we acknowledge that people with mental illness do have a disability that can be helped if they get the support they need. And the reason I oftentimes tell people I have depression and anxiety is because I don't want that to be a taboo topic. It's not embarrassing to me. It's not a weakness. It's not bad. It's a disability. So before we go on, what questions or concerns does anyone have? Or comments? Anything? All right. For many, many years, people talked about person-first terminology. So it would be something like a person with autism. Well, in the last few years, people, especially people with autism, are starting to talk about identity first and not person first. So they will say, perhaps, I'm autistic, or I have some friends who are autistics. When I first heard that terminology, it was so jarring to me because it had been for so long that publications wouldn't accept anything if it didn't have person first. It was expected that people would use that terminology. And in fact, if somebody didn't use that terminology, it was considered antiquated, it was considered to be a negative kind of thing. But now it's much more common. And so if you work with people with disabilities, now, one of the things I always tell my students is I try to say disabled people, and I'll write it down so that I make sure to say it, but it's so ingrained in me to say people with disabilities that I oftentimes use that terminology. But I'm changing. But if you're working with somebody who has a disability, listen to how they identify themselves, because most people with autism, most people that are deaf or hard of hearing, they will say, I am a deaf person, or I am hard of hearing, rather than a person with. In other disability areas, sometimes people use person first and sometimes people use identity first. In a study that was done in 2020 of more than 800 self-advocates who completed the survey, almost 89% indicated a preference for identity first terminology or language. So that is something that just to keep in mind, that if somebody identifies themselves as an autistic, I have autism, or I am autistic, use the term that they use, and just respect that they have a choice in that. Some people are saying now that your go-to should be identity first. So it should be, this person is disabled. When I was talking to my class at one point, and I was saying, how many times do we use person first and identity first when we're identifying ourselves? So I might say, I'm a man. I probably wouldn't say I'm a person with maleness. I'm a professor. I don't say I'm a person who is a professor or who professes or who. So a lot of what we do in everyday language is identity first. So just to keep that in mind, that may certainly be changing depending on the where you are in the country and who you're talking to. Alan Wolfelt has 10 mourners' bill of rights. And just recently I reread this and I thought this is so important for everyone, but especially I think for disabled people to be aware of this. Is you have the right to experience your own unique grief. The way a person grieves and mourns is their unique grief, and they get to do whatever they need to do as long as they're not hurting themselves, other people, or property. That's when I work with kids, especially whether they have disabilities or not, and they're angry, I say, wow, that's your emotion, that you get to be angry. You just don't get to hurt anybody, yourself, or property. So people have the right to their own unique grief. They have the right to talk about their grief. And if somebody is nonverbal, they have the right to express their grief in whatever way that they can express their grief. They have the right to feel a multitude of emotions. I just talked to somebody a couple weeks ago, and she said that she was relieved that her grandpa died. And she said, I think I'm a bad person. And I said, well, relief is an emotion. It doesn't mean that you're glad. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that there's a sense of relief. And she said, well, I didn't want him to die, but he was in such pain. It's like, of course. So you would be relieved. And that is an emotion. And people have the right to feel whatever they're feeling. You have the right to be tolerant of your physical and emotional limits. You have the right to experience grief bursts, which sometimes people call them grief spurts or grief attacks. And what that is, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, it's cyclical grieving is what it is. Is that, so for instance, when my dad died, I was 5 years old. And I still, he died June 4th, when I was 5. And I, to this day, have a grief burst when I smell lilacs and smell peonies, because he died when they were in full bloom. And so it just brings me back to the time that he died. People have the right to make use of rituals. And we'll talk about rituals a little bit as we go through, but rituals by nature are symbolic. And so that can be challenging because some people who are concrete thinkers can't make use of symbolism or abstract kinds of rituals. And so what do we do to try to make that more concrete? You have the right to embrace your spirituality, whatever that may be. You have the right to search for meaning. You have the right to treasure your memories, and you have the right to move toward your grief and healing. A lot of our society tells us to move away from grief. We have 3 days off from work. I am actually appalled by that, that people are expected to get back to work and be functioning after the death of a significant person. So that, there's a lot of things that society says get back to normal. Well, there's no more normal. There's a new normal, but there's no more normal the way it was prior to the death. Are there any questions or comments before we go on?
I do have a question, especially since you mentioned people who are nonverbal.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the work that we do as death care workers involves, placing a high priority on things like consent and autonomy and making sure that everything is the way the person wants it to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for people who maybe not only are nonverbal, but can't express themselves at all,
right.
What is the way that the disability community handles things like, what to do with their death care, and what happens if you're trying to do an advanced directive for them? Like, how is that typically handled?
It depends on a variety of things. If we're talking about somebody who has a very severe limitation to communication and to cognitive skills, often what happens, unfortunately, or what it just happens, is that the person who is the guardian or the conservator, usually it's a guardian, is the one who helps to interpret what that person probably wants. And it's not perfect because oftentimes people don't know exactly what they want. Now, there are sometimes parents or people that are very close to a person who doesn't communicate through language and has a difficult time with cognitive skills will know the person really well. And so they can say things to the person, or they can show the person something, and just by the person might even groan or make some kind of sound, they say, oh, they like that. Well, from somebody on the outside, they might say, how would you know that? Well, I know them. But with people who are a little more verbal and have more cognitive skills, there are some really, and this is going off from your question a bit, but there are some really nice resources, and I didn't write them down to bring them right now, but I could get those to Isabel if, or somewhere, or you can email me. You could email me, and I can get you information. Going through end of life care and what people want and what they don't want, and it's done in a very respectful and very simple way, so that if a person is able to participate, that they can do that.
Yeah, if you send me those, I would love to be able to send them out to the broader group.
Okay. I will write that down because I will forget otherwise. All right. Other questions, comments? Don, did that help at all, or was that kind of begging the question? Was it Dawn that asked?
Oh no, that was my own question.
Oh, that was your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was mixed up with the screens, and I thought it was Dawn talking.
Oh, no worries.
The rights that we just talked about might look different for people for disabled people and from non-disabled people. So for instance, like we were talking about with rituals, a ritual that's symbolic is not going to help anybody that is a cognitive thinker. There's also some things that even getting support, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, is that when people say certain things that may be common for someone to say to a person who's grieving, a person who is concrete in their thinking, that might be very confusing, and it might be even taken as not an insult necessarily, but as something that's kind of out of character, or why are you saying this to me at this time? So some of them might look different, and they might have a different timeline for disabled people versus non-disabled people. Though I think all of us, to some extent, depending on the person who has died, will have some delayed reaction. And it's more common if somebody who died was not in contact with you every day, or didn't live by you, or whatever it might be. And if they die, it takes a while to really understand in your heart and emotionally and spiritually and so on, that they're gone, that they have died. I remember when my mother died, she had collected and made dolls. That's one of her cool things. And every time I would go in a store and I'd see a doll, I think, got to tell mom about this. This is so cool. She'll love this. And it was a couple months after she died, and I went into a store, and I saw this doll, and I thought, oh, I got to tell mom. I'm going to call her right now. And I took my cell phone out and went, oh, wait a minute. I can't do that. And so that happens. And especially if somebody, let's say somebody lives in a group home or a facilitated residence, where they might live with other people and have support and so on, and their parents live somewhere else, and a parent dies, it might take them quite a while to really fully understand that person's not coming back. People may need another person as an advocate for these rights, because they may not understand the rights, they may not know the rights, and so they might need somebody to support them and to help them with that. And people with disabilities need to develop self-advocacy skills. One of the things that we are really trying to do when we talk about death education with presumably non-grieving children is to help them to be self-advocates, whether they have a disability or not, to be an advocate when they are grieving and say, this is what I need. Not that they just try to ignore their feelings or they try to ignore their needs. This is what I just want to say this up front, is that an 18-year-old person with, let's say, a cognitive disability is not the same as a 6-year-old. I hear that oftentimes, even in education and even in special education, people will say, well, they're like a 6-year-old. No, they're not. No, they are an 18-year-old who has 18 years of experience. They're physically 18 years old. They are an 18-year-old person who may be a concrete thinker. They may be an 18-year-old person who has some challenges and limitations in certain areas, but they're an 18-year-old person. Adults with disabilities are adults, and they should not be prevented from doing things that they consider things they like to do that others might say are childish. So I wrote down some examples because I color a lot. I like to color. I have coloring books. I get to do that because people don't perceive me as having a disability and that being childish. People play with dolls all the time. I have friends who collect, I can't think of what they are, but they're adults that collect little figures, and they kind of have little, it's like superhero kind of figures, and they talk about what their adventures are and so on. Watching cartoons. Now people watch cartoons all the time, adults without disabilities, and yet if if an adult wants to watch Winnie the Pooh, and that's their favorite cartoon and that's their favorite show, sometimes care providers will say, no, you can't do that. That's not age appropriate. Yeah, it is. It's as age appropriate as anything else, and people need to have the rights to choose what's important to them. Choice is really important, and a lot of people with whatever disability they have, oftentimes their rights for choice are taken away. This article is a little old. It's 33 years old now, but I love the article, and the name of it is, the first part of it is a little technical, balancing the right of habituation with the right of personal liberties. But the second part, the right of people with developmental disabilities to eat too many donuts and take a nap. I love that. We all eat too many donuts. We all take naps. And yet it's oftentimes people who are concrete thinkers are in a situation where other people are telling them what they can and can't do. In another part of my life, I also teach sexuality education for people with disabilities. And that's the other area that it's like, oh, come on. It's like, well, we don't want them dating because they might get hurt. And I will say, how many of us who have dated have not been hurt? I think it's almost zero. And people learn from it and they go on. And so we need to give them that dignity as well. I want to talk just briefly about how I got into the area of thanatology. Very briefly, because we're going long here. But when I was 5, my daddy died. And I always say daddy because that's how I knew him when he died. He went into the hospital on a Monday and died the following Tuesday. So he was in about a week. I don't know exactly what it was that caused him to die. From what I can make out with things I've read, is that he had pancreatitis, and it poisoned his system. And he was allergic to antibiotics that they had at the time. And so his temperature went up to 106 and stayed there. And he died within a week. This was taken a couple of years before he died. This was 4 of us. There are 5, and mom was 35 years old when daddy died. She had 5 kids. She didn't work outside the family. She didn't have a driver's license. She didn't know where the checkbook was. She had planned to be a housewife, as she said, for her whole life. And when he died, it just was a horrible upheaval, as death can be for people. This is me in the white with the red trim. I was so cute then. This is my sister, and she doesn't have a bandage on her head. That's a ripped photo. Because some people say, oh, what happened? No, it's a ripped photo. But when I started kindergarten the next fall, and my kindergarten teacher was not somebody that interacted with kids much in a positive way, put it that way. And grieving children, it was very challenging for her. So she just yelled at me all the time. I'd start crying. I had major separation anxiety that I still is still a challenge for me today. Though I have a lot of coping strategies, it's still a challenge. I was convinced every time I left in the morning to go to school that somebody else in my family would die by the time I got home. That was my reality. And she would tell me that if I didn't stop crying, I'd have to go home with the babies. You want to wear diapers because you're acting like a baby. Oh, it was horrible, 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 horrible. Well, then I went into first grade. I'm not going to go through every grade. I promise you, just kindergarten, first grade. This was my first grade teacher. Her name was Miss Meyer. And one of the first days of school, I was sitting at my desk and I started to cry. And she came over to me and she said, you know, I know you miss your dad a lot. And if you need to cry, you go ahead and cry as much as you need to. And if you don't want to cry in front of the other kids, you just let me know and I'll go out in the hall with you and I'll sit with you as long as you want me to sit with you and you can cry. I can hardly tell that story. And that was many, many years ago. She became like a saint to me because she was the only adult that I knew that I felt got it. Well, after years and years, I lost track of her. And about 10 years ago, on a whim, I contacted my elementary school and I said, I have this story to tell you. And if you can find her, I would love it. And they did. That is Miss Meyer today. And we have communicated a lot. And when I wrote to her, I said, you know, this was a very long time ago. You probably don't remember me. And she said, yes, I do. And she said, I remember that situation. And she said, I didn't know what to do other than to tell you that you had the right to cry and to feel whatever you felt. And I thought, you go, she's still my angel. I mean, she's just like, whoa, she's fantastic. And she taught right up until when I contacted her 10 years ago, she had just retired. So that was really nice that she still had a real recent experience with teaching and working with kids. So some unique needs of people with disabilities. I want to talk about that. These are some pictures. There's a wonderful cemetery in Minneapolis called Lakewood. And Lakewood is, I think it's 9 or 10 acres. It's a beautiful, beautiful cemetery. A lot of famous people are buried there or have niches. Paul Wellstone, some people from Minnesota that were like politicians. Tiny Tim, the singer, is there. So it's a very kind of upscale cemetery, but has the most beautiful tombstones. So I sometimes like going through there and just looking at the tombstones and so on. I'm going to just refer to people with disabilities or disabled people as people and or as individuals from now on, unless there's a reason that I would say having a disability. People with having a disability, oftentimes people experience what's called chronic sorrow, or that's what they thought years ago. And Joan Blaska, she coined the term cyclical grieving. Cyclical grieving, she said, was like grief spurts. But for her, she had a son with a cognitive disability. And she said when she started reading information on the grief that parents feel, she would read about chronic grief. And she thought, this isn't my experience. I feel grief every once in a while at milestones. I felt grief when all the other kids were riding bikes and he just didn't have the wherewithal to ride a bike. I felt some grief, but she said it comes and goes. And not only for parents of people with disabilities, but for a person with a disability, it also can experience cyclical grief around their disability or around the death of someone. But I think, for instance, my diabetes. I just recently got off of insulin, but that means that I have to eat really low carb. And today I was really grieving carbs. That really was bugging me today because I wanted to have a piece of cake. And I could choose that. It would be very bad for me, and I chose not to. But that comes and goes. And and sometimes it is nothing to it. And sometimes I could say, no problem. But today was not one of those days. It can occur frequently. It can occur less frequently as time goes on. And that's the same for the death of a significant person, is that grief spurts can happen at different times, and it gets less as time goes on. So even though every spring when I smell peonies and lilacs and it's a grief spurt for me with my dad, it's less intense. It's not as intense as it used to be. And now I can even enjoy smelling lilacs. Before I used to, people would say, oh, don't they smell wonderful? And I'd say, no, no, those smell really bad. If somebody is capable of love, they're capable of grief. And so even people with very severe disabilities can love. It might not look like the same kind of love that other people might label as love, but it's love. Sometimes the grief doesn't look like what people expect. If somebody's crying or they're sad or they're depressed, then we kind of say, yes, they're grieving. I can tell that. But with some people, their expression of grief is more about emotional expression or irritability or sleep problems or anxiety or expressions of fear. And that can be grief as well. And so we need to look at grief as a much wider scope, especially for people with disabilities, because they may not be showing the same kind of grief that people without disabilities might be showing. It wasn't that long ago where most people with severe disabilities would not outlive their parents. Now, many disabled people are outliving their parents. And when a parent dies, not only is that somebody that the disabled person loves, but they lose somebody who probably is the most familiar with their needs and to whom they have a really trusting relationship. Many people, especially with severe disabilities or mental illness, are left out of rituals of mourning altogether, or oftentimes people call it deaths around. So sending flowers, getting a card, and there's a significant number of people with severe disabilities who are not even told about the death. I had a student that said, oh, I work in a residence, and one of the women I work with, she's just really mad, and she's acting out all the time. And she said, her mom died a couple months ago, and we didn't tell her until just recently. And she said, what do we do? And I said, well, number one, I would say you have a lot of atoning to do for that. I said, what a terrible thing to do to somebody. And she said, well, we thought we were protecting her. And I said, no. It's hard to tell somebody that someone has died. It's always difficult, no matter who. And people might think with a person who is disabled that they might not understand the death. I always say to people when they say, well, they won't understand death, I say, who does? It's surreal. It's like the person was there physically and now they're not. That's surreal. Or sometimes people will say, well, they'll act out. So plan for it. Have extra people around, have a space where they can scream and yell and do whatever they need to do where they won't hurt themselves or other people or property. That can be really confusing and frustrating for a person to disappear. And I have very strong feelings about that. And as I said, people think they're protecting. It's not protecting. It oftentimes is much worse down the line with the grieving process. The other thing is that death education for disabled people is almost non-existent. It's almost non-existent for everyone. and that's why we're doing it at the church that I belong to, is we want, if it's possible, for the young kids in the church to, when they grow up, that they're not afraid and that they can talk about it, and they are fascinated by every aspect that we talk about. When we talk about cremation and green funerals, and they're just like, what? Really? You can do that? In the midst of this, when we were teaching 6th and 7th graders, one of the students' grandpa died. And the mother was telling me that she sat him down and she said that his grandpa died. And he said, okay, well, what is his final disposition going to be? And she said, what do you mean? And he said, well, is his body going to be buried? Is he going to be cremated? Is it going to be a green funeral? And the mother was like, where are you getting this? She said, you know more than I do. And he said, well, that's what we're learning. And so she came and she said, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because not only was he learning and comfortable, but he helped me to be more comfortable as well. The more severe a disability is, the more grief will go unrecognized. A person may not want to attend some sort of a ritual or a ceremony. And what I would say is you inform them as much as possible, and you tell them as much as possible of what they might see if they choose to, and how they might experience other people's grief, and then you let them decide. That is really hard for me. And I've had it happen several times where people with disabilities will say, I'm not going to my mom's funeral. Well, this is what you're going to see. I understand. Yep, that's good. Not going. They get to decide that, and should not ever be shamed about it. They need to be part of the family, the community. One of the things that is in a lot of literature is how a number of disability areas and people with disabilities have compulsive behaviors when they're grieving. A lot of people without disabilities have compulsive behaviors as well. And one of the things that I would say is, if I walk into a room and I can look up and start counting the tiles on the ceiling, I have control. And grief is so out of control. And especially if a disabled person doesn't have a lot of experience with deaths around, so they haven't been given the experience of knowing what this is all about, and what is grief and so on, it can be really, really confusing and feel out of control. Grief feels out of control anyway. We talked about it can be delayed. It can seem more intense if the person's intense. I am an intense person. And when I grieve very intensely. And sometimes I remember when my mother died and I was keening. I was just really, really upset, and I showed it. And some people said, this is uncomfortable for the other people here. And I said, would you like me to leave, or would you like me to ask them to leave? Because I'm not going to stop. And I think people with disabilities also have that right, is to say, sometimes if I'm just with another person, they say, oh, you need to stop crying. It's like, well, I'm not going to, so you could leave if you want to, because this is who I am. Sometimes people with disabilities, they're labeled as having challenging behaviors rather than grieving, and they're punished. I say this to my students all the time. You cannot punish a disability out of a person. You cannot punish grief out of a person. You cannot punish trauma out of a person. And so just to keep that in mind, that if somebody is acting out and it may be out of character, they're probably grieving, or they've experienced some trauma. I'm going to open it up for questions before we go on, or comments, or anything that you're thinking right now about anything we've talked about, or things that seem like it's surprising or whatever. What do people want to say, or have to say, or need to say?
I'm just gonna go ahead whenever I don't see hands, because there's so many things that this conversation has brought up for me. one of the things that I appreciate you bringing up is this notion of like, okay, either you're going to leave or I'm going to leave, because one of the things that we have internally at the NHFA been discussing as an organization is this paper. I don't know if you might have heard of it before, called The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture. And one of the characteristics that they talk about is right to comfort, right? And the reason why I think that this particular concept is often sort of like misconstrued is because it's sort of like you have a gut reaction, I think, when you hear right to comfort, where you're like, oh, well, everyone deserves comfort. Like everyone wants to have comfort, right? But I think the salient notion, and I think this applies, in a lot of different contexts, whether it's like race or disability or, anywhere where there's likely to be tension, basically, is this notion that comfort is zero sum, right? Like if someone's uncomfortable, there's like one side is going to have, if in order to like restore the sort of status quo of people, everyone like being comfortable, which is what people want to do in that situation, either like one person has to change or the other person has to change, right? And so often the onus is on the person who's in the more marginalized community to change,
Yes.
right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm no, I was just thinking one of the things that with autistic people, sometimes people self-stimulate.
Yeah.
And we all do it.
Right.
We all self-stim. But I had a student one time, and another student was self-stimming, and he was doing something with his fingers, and the student said, "That's really bothering me." And I said, "Well, you're free to move. He's free to do what he needs to do, and you're free to move." And at first that was just jarring to him. Like, what do you mean? He's doing something I don't like, stop him from doing it. No. People have the right to do what they need to do. That, once I came to that realization, that has helped me in so many areas of my life. It's like, I don't get to tell somebody how they behave. I don't get to do that. And if it bothers me, I have the choice of leaving that situation if I need to, but I don't get to tell them to stop. And that's what happens with suffocated grief, oftentimes, where in hospital settings, for instance, just recently in Minneapolis, this happened, where there was a person who had been shot, a BIPOC person who had been shot, and he was in the hospital. The hospital called the family to come in, and the family thought that they were going to tell them that he was going to be all right. And they brought balloons, and oh my God, and the doctor went in and said he died. They were screaming. Wow. And just beside, I mean, they were my people, because that's how I would respond. They called security. And said, we're afraid the doctors are going to be hurt. Why? The doctors, if they felt like, they didn't feel that way, but if they had felt something they could have left. That family had the right to behave whatever way they needed to at that time. Oh, I totally. Do you know Tershel Border?
No.
Oh, I will email you her information. You would love her. She does so much work in the area of suffocated grief, and how people of color especially are disenfranchised and punished because of the way they grieve.
Yeah, totally. And I think honestly, like I do appreciate that there are more and more ways in which I think that people are trying to normalize things that would have otherwise been considered like, for particular groups, right? And making it just a part of the culture of what everyone is doing, right? Like in Philadelphia, not that long ago, like a few months ago, they opened like a rage room because, Philadelphia sports fans are notoriously full of rage, right?
Yes.
And it's just sort of like, oh, like this is something that is considered something that anyone, would possibly want or have access to, which is not necessarily something that would have necessarily happened like 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
I don't know, right?
Right. Oh, thank you for sharing that bringing that up, because it really, I think with everyone, but especially for what we're talking about, that if a person has a disability, whatever that disability might be, people need to not squelch their expression, but perhaps to plan for it. And so I work with hospice sometimes, and primarily who I work with are people who have mental illness, cognitive disabilities, or children. And there was a woman that I worked with at one point, and she had a variety of mental illness and developmental disabilities. Her grandpa died, and her grandma didn't tell her till after the funeral, and said, "I don't want you coming. I didn't want you coming. You would make a scene, and we don't need that." Well, as part of her disability, she didn't realize that he really had died, because the grandma would sometimes call, and then she'd say, "Well, let me talk to grandpa." And the grandma would say, he died. And she'd say, "He did not." Because she had no hinge for this. She had nothing to anchor this to. So when we were talking, I said, "You know what? Let's do this. Let's see if your grandma took any pictures at the funeral, and we'll have a funeral for him here." And she said, "Okay." And we did. We, with some people that she knew, came over, and we sat around the kitchen table, and the grandma did have pictures, and we had the pictures on the table, and we talked about the grandpa, and she just started sobbing. And she said, "He's really dead." And I said, "Yeah." People need something to hook onto, and they need to be told the truth about things. There's, from my perspective, and I know the grandma had experienced a lot of things with this woman when she was younger that was embarrassing or difficult and challenging, and I get that. And the mindset I think that I always want to foster is, how can we include everyone and not exclude anyone? And what do we need to do to make that happen? And there are things we can make things happen. So, anything else? All right. I'm going to just keep talking for a little while. And then when we get to a point, I will skip to the end, because I want to read you the poem. Are you familiar with Irma Bombeck?
No.
No, she was much, you're way too young for knowing who she was. I knew who she was, a humorous writer. And she found out that she had cancer, and she wrote this poem about, what would I do if I could live my life over? And I got to read that at the end, because I love that poem. Respond to people honestly. People can handle what they know. They can't handle what they don't know. And sometimes it's really hard, but people need to do it. And if you don't know, just say, "I don't know." I've worked in hospice, especially with people with cognitive disabilities or other disabilities. They'll ask me questions. It's like, I don't know, but I'm certainly not going to make something up. I had somebody say one time, why, this was at a funeral that included a casket and a body and embalming. And the person said, "How come his eyes are closed?" "I don't know." I mean, I said, "Well, I don't really know, but it could be that people might think he could see and he can't see." "Oh, did he die with his eyes open or closed?" "I don't know." "Do most people die with their eyes open or closed?" And it just went on, and I kept thinking, where is this coming from? And I've had several people do that, ask about the eyes. And what I realize is, for a lot of people, that's how they know someone, is through their eyes. They look at them. And so, but if you don't know, say, "I don't know." And if you, the other thing, especially with anyone, but people with disabilities, with kids, whoever, if you say, "I'll try to find out and get back to you," get back to them. If you ever even hint that you're promising something, please do it. A lot of listening will take place right after the death, but weeks and months after. And the permanence of death for everyone can take a long time. Seek out concrete rituals if the person is concrete. I wrote a little book years ago, and if anybody would like a PDF of it, email me and I can send you the PDF. So it's not the book, but it's the PDF of it. It's got all the information, and it just gives a lot of ideas for creating concrete rituals for people. And it can have to do with nonverbal kinds of things, with music and pictures and art and tactile experiences and smells and that kind of thing. But as much as possible, it puts it into a realm of something that's concrete rather than symbolic. Oh, don't use euphemisms. That can be very confusing. If somebody says that somebody's asleep, they will think they need to wake up. Or they'll be really afraid to go to sleep. If this is what happens when I go to sleep, not going to happen. Use the words dead, dying, died with whoever you're talking to. It could be, I mean, I know Minnesota is very, we tend to be very passive aggressive, and like really passive aggressive. But one of the things that I've had some challenges with people, they say, well, I wouldn't say to this person that the person died. I'd say they passed away or we lost them. It's like, okay, well, first of all, that could be very confusing. But if you're going to say they passed away, you say what that means is they died. And what that means is when a person's body stops working, they're dead. And they will never start working again. That's what it means to be dead. And I'm using the word passed away, but that's what it means. Because people who are concrete thinkers, ooh, look at all the euphemisms that we use. These are unbelievable to me. How many of them are just commonplace? I didn't know what some of them meant, but people have explained it to me. Like cooking for the Kennedys, expired, that's used in healthcare. Sometimes when somebody has died, passed, lost. I mean, if you say we lost grandma this morning, the response might very well be, well, we better look for her, because it's a concrete kind of thing. Go to meet your maker, kick the bucket, negative patient care outcome, did not meet their full health potential. These are actual euphemisms people have used. It's like, okay. Be aware of burdensome and confusing messages like, I'm sorry. I heard a person speak at a conference just recently who was autistic. And she said when her spouse died, people kept saying, I'm sorry. And she would say, did you kill him? And then people would get really upset. And they would be like, of course not. And it's like, don't do that. Don't use it unless you killed the person. I mean, it may have been somehow that happened where you were the cause, but otherwise just saying I'm sorry can be really confusing to people. Also, sometimes people will kind of say that the person died because of some behavior they had and it was their fault. So they died from lung cancer because they smoked. And to try to, as much as possible, talk about it doesn't matter how a person died. They're gone, and grief doesn't go away because of the way the person died. Saying to a person, the person will be kept alive in your memory. A lot of people with disabilities may really perseverate on that and think, oh no, I better not forget. Because if I forget the person, then they're going to be gone because they're alive in my memory. And so I have to do something to make sure I remember them all the time. Well, have something like a memory box, record memories, write them down, take pictures, whatever it might be. And so the person can say, oh, there they are. Those are the memories. That's what's going to keep them alive, or whatever it might be. And that can be helpful. Also, things like God took them because they were finished with what they had to do on earth. Really? I'm here. Excuse me. If that happened, I'm not thrilled with God because God took them too early. They were so good on earth that God wanted them to be an angel in heaven. I was told that when Daddy died. I was 5, and I was told that, and it was like, really? Really? Well, I ain't going to be good because that's not going to happen to me. They're in a better place. Even if you think that, please don't say that to anybody. Because as a person said one time, she was showing a picture of her son who died by suicide, and another person said he's in a better place, and she said, I don't care if he's in a better place or not. I don't care, and please don't ever say that to me again. And I thought, you go. that is very direct. It's like, nope, this is what I'm not gonna. This is my boundary. Don't be sad. That's another thing that people will say a lot. And I know when my a dear friend of ours died, and people would say, "Are you all right?" And it's like, of course I'm not all right. This person just died who I love dearly, but I would just say, I'm very sad. And it's going to get better as time goes on and as I get support. My internal dialogue was a little different. Minimize change as much as possible, because that can be really confusing for people, and it can be just another loss that people have. I do want to just share one brief story. I worked with a group of people in hospice, and it was recommended that I talk to this group. It was a group of men that lived in a facility, a residence, and there were they each had their own bedroom, and there were about 7 of them lived in a house, and they had some staff that were there, and one of the residents overnight died. And the family decided not to have any kind of a ceremony at all. And the people that were at the residence were really, really upset about everything. And they had questions like, he was my friend, can he still be my friend? Yes. People die, love never dies. And one of the things they were having a little battle with the owner of the place was, they said, you're not going to move anyone else in there because that's his room. And the owner was saying, I have to. And they were saying, nope, that's his room. You leave it alone. Well, if that's a possibility to leave it there for a year, that would be great. The owner didn't think that was a possibility. And so what we came up with, which I thought was really cool, was they took pictures of the room. The owner said they could take the door off. They took the door off. They put the pictures on the door, and they put the door in the living room. They put a new door on the room, and they changed everything in the room. They painted it a different color. They put a different bed. They did everything different. That was no longer his room. That wasn't his door. The door, his room was in the living room with the door and the pictures. And so there are ways, I think, of accommodating needs of people when they conflict like that with having change that may not be wanted, or I don't think it would. My tendency would be to say leave the room alone for a while, but that just didn't seem like a possibility, and so yeah, include people as much as possible. Don't exclude in anything. Invite people in and talk about how you're going to include, rather than how, what we're going to do to exclude this person. All right, I want to read this poem, and then if there are any more questions or comments, we can do that, and then we will just close. This is written by Irma Bombeck, and it's called Irma's Angel. And she wrote this when she learned that she had terminal cancer. I recently learned she didn't die from the cancer that she was diagnosed with. She died from something else, but that doesn't take away what she did with this poem. These are pictures of really important people to me. And so I want to just share one of my favorite people in the world is my son. And he has a Bazinga shirt on, which is indicative of kind of some of the characteristics that he has around Sameness. He likes sameness. When our son came home, he was adopted from Guatemala. We found out he had a disease called histiocytosis, which is a blood disease that impacts different parts of the body. And it was in his head, and it was eating his skull away. And when we found this out, the doctor said, this is curable because it's in an external kind of organ. So if it was in his heart or his liver, it would be much more challenging to treat. Ironically, you have to be Scandinavian to get this disease, because we thought, well, he's Mayan, maybe that is part of it. No. So his bio dad is probably Scandinavian. He was on heavy doses of chemo for 6 months. At 6 months old, he started chemo. And so it was really hard. It was a really difficult time. And in the midst of that, I learned this poem. I heard about this poem. And I remember one night he was just inconsolable. And at 3 a.m, I finally got him to settle down, and I was holding him. And I was exhausted. And I started thinking of this poem, and I thought, this is so cool. I get to hold him. When he's 15, he's not going to let me do this. This is so cool. But it was this poem. So I always like to kind of have people leave with this when in talking about death, because it's like, whatever you're thinking of doing, do it. Okay, so she says, I would have talked less and listened more. I would have invited friends over to dinner, even if the carpet was stained and the sofa faded. I would have eaten the popcorn in the good living room and worried much less about dirt when somebody wanted to light a fire in the fireplace. I would have taken the time to listen to my grandfather ramble about his youth. I would never have insisted the car windows be rolled up on a summer day because my hair had just been teased and sprayed. I would have burned the pink candle sculptured like a rose before it melted in storage. I would have sat on the lawn with my children and not worried about grass stains. I would have cried and laughed less while watching television and more while watching life. I would have gone to bed when I was sick instead of pretending the earth would go into a holding pattern if I weren't there for the day. I would never have bought anything just because it was practical, wouldn't show soil, or was guaranteed to last a lifetime. Instead of wishing away 9 months of pregnancy, I'd have cherished every moment, realizing the wonderful growing inside me was the only chance in life to assist God in a miracle. When my kids kissed me impetuously, I would never have said, later, now go and wash up for dinner. There would have been more I love yous and more I'm sorries. But mostly, given another shot at life, I would seize every minute, look at it, really see it, live it, and never give it back. So, questions, comments?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was very powerful. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Well, again, for everyone who wants to give a comment, feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you. Otherwise, I will just keep going into my thoughts. As someone who myself has a background in human-centered design, I really appreciate that you mentioned universal design. I refer to it as inclusive design. But like this concept that if you're designing for everyone or designing for the most vulnerable, that actually designs better things for everyone, right? And so that's like a big concept within human-centered design. And I was wondering if you would mind if I could share something on my screen.
Sure.
Because I saw this recently and I thought it was such a good example of really succinctly explaining what the concept of human-centered design and inclusive design specifically is all about, right? So basically it's a cartoon. I saw this at I was at South by Southwest in March. So I saw this at one of those presentations. So I can't take credit for finding this, but I had not seen it before that. And I thought this was really great. basically it is a cartoon of a bunch of kids waiting to go into the school in on a snowy day, much like a day you might encounter in Minnesota. And basically there's a guy who's shoveling the stairs, right? And there's a kid in a wheelchair that says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the guy's saying, "Oh, well, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling the stairs for them, I'll clear the ramp for you." And the kid in the wheelchair is like, "Okay, but if you just shovel the ramp, we can all get in faster," right? I don't
Yep.
know if you've seen this before, but
That actually happened at the school I was teaching at.
yeah,
The custodians shoveled the stairs, and we said, "Please do the ramp."
yes,
They were like, "Why?" "Because all of us can use the ramp." And then they were like, "Oh, I get it now. Okay." Yeah. I
totally.
love it. I love that cartoon. It's really it just sums up the whole thing about. I love that inclusive design, that title, rather than universal design. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples that I often give to people when I'm trying to explain the concept is there is the brand OXO that sells like the kitchen implements, and you
Mhm.
can, and they have like the big bowls that have like the rubber bottoms and like the really chunky like vegetable peelers and stuff. They design all of their tools with people with arthritis and other motor, gross motor conditions, right? And the end result is that you actually have product, like the idea is you then have products and services and systems that actually work better for everybody,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. When I've talked about this with students, I usually just show a lot of architecture that is universal design. And then it's like, I say, like, cut out curbs. What, who benefits from that? And they're like, well, bikers, people that use wheelchairs, strollers, it's just across the board.
Yeah,
But I love that cartoon because that is so, I think it's it's like a paradigm shift for a
yeah,
lot of people to say, what can we do to make this the most accessible to most people? Absolutely. And there's resistance. I find it to be frustrating. Our son went to a dual immersion Spanish English school, and there were two things that happened while I was there, and I don't speak much Spanish, a little tiny bit. And we would do the newsletter, and I was in charge of the newsletter, and so we do it in Spanish and English. And I said, so the first letter I put Spanish on the one side because most of the people that went to the school and the parents and the kids were Spanish speakers, and the English on the other side. And they said, "No, the English goes first." And I said, "Why?"
yeah,
I mean, that wasn't necessarily a universal design, but I was saying, "Why?" They said, "Well, that's the way we do it." And I said, "We don't have to. I mean, it can be very easily changed." Well, the other piece of it was that a lot of the parents were illiterate. And I said, "How about if we have a phone number on the form and tell people, just call this number and we'll read it over the phone?" "No, that would take too much work. They can find somebody to read it." "No, this is not okay." But I think oftentimes because people have a different paradigm, and it's the same with people with disabilities. It's like, well, let's do this. Well, that's not what we do. We don't include people with disability. I am a major advocate for saying include them in every part of the funeral arrangement, whatever that is, that they can be involved with. And sometimes it's saying, we're going to have flowers. You get to pick out the flowers. Do you want this one or this one? And they get to point. They're involved. It's just, to me, it's a disservice to everyone not to include as many people as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that like I also can't take credit for this, but I think I was hearing it in like maybe it was Crip Camp, like a documentary that I saw
Oh,
recently,
I
right?
love Crip Camp. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was a quote that someone said where it's like, we're all future disabled people, right? It's not like you're designing this for some ambiguous other person that you've never met. Like you're designing this like again, there's so many things that all of us could benefit from baseline as we are today, right? But then it's like, okay, well, think of, if you want to live a long life, right? Chances are at some point you're going to have a physical impairment of some kind and or a cognitive impairment of some
Cognitive,
kind,
yes.
right?
Or hearing or vision or, yeah. Oh,
we're living longer and longer, right?
You know, I was saying to somebody the other day, I am 65 and I am losing things I never knew I had. um, and it's kind of startling in some ways. Even though I've always had that notion that at some point certain things are going to be problematic. Is it still like, really? Really, this is happening? Absolutely, absolutely. Everybody's got limitations. Just today, everybody has limitations and everybody has strengths. And if we can emphasize the strengths in the inclusive design, that would be just so wonderful on so many levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I am so glad that we had 3 additional participants. Yay. And it's going to be recorded, so yay.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to come off mute and, comment or ask a question,
Yeah,
like, please feel free to do
I
that.
would love that. Or not, whatever. Oh, hi. Yay.
Thank you so much for speaking to the disabled population and how we can include folks in decision making and grief and inclusion in choices for end of life and for bereavement. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for attending. I really appreciate it. Well, I love talking about this topic because I think it's so important and it's not talked about very much. So.
Yeah, and I appreciate also that you talk about it from the point of view, at least in my experience, I feel like I've mostly heard about talked about in the context of a parent losing a disabled child. And I appreciate that you're really emphasizing the other directionality of, like, it in my, it just seems like it would be in many ways so much more devastating in the other direction, where you are like losing the one person who can understand all of those things that you're describing, of like, oh, I understand like the things that they say that maybe other people don't know how to interpret. Losing that is such a devastating thing to lose.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And like I said, I mean, years ago, it wasn't an issue because people died young. Disabled people died much earlier, and still do. I mean, as I showed at the beginning, the 5 students I had died in their 40s and 50s. And so that's young. And most of them, their parents were still alive, but a couple of them, they weren't. And that was really devastating.
Yeah.
So.
And from a home funeral context, right? Like, and that is one of the things that doing a home funeral affords people so much more like power and creativity to be able to think of creative ways to include people of all different, abilities, learning styles, like whatever, like ways of grieving, like whatever it may be. And that's one of the reasons I think so many people like to be able to choose how their service looks like and have it in a space that's already comfortable for them.
Absolutely. Right. How great is that? If a person has a disability and is comfortable in their surroundings, and you bring that to them rather than them going out somewhere. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's just great.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for everything you're doing with and being the president. Yay. That's a lot. But thank you. And thank you for people coming, and we'll just go from there. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of this. This has been a really great presentation, and thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you for the people who are coming off mute. This was excellent.
Bye. Thank you.
Yep. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.